and the Honourable Member Mr Thomas.
Thank you, Mr President. In the March sitting of Tynwald, I committed to make a more detailed statement in this honourable court of planning. I would like to focus now on some key points. In terms of the appointment of a planning inspector for the East Area Plan, in accordance with Schedule 1 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1999, the inquiry shall be conducted by a person or persons appointed by the Governor for the purpose. The candidate who is fully aware of and experienced in the island's planning system and context has been identified. Cabinet Office will assist the independent inspector in the coming months, responding to any requests so that a meticulous and thorough inquiry can be prepared and then run. The independent inspector is required to prepare a report which will be published as soon as practicable after receipt. The drafting and completion of the report is in the hands of the inspector and clearly influenced by the length and complexity of the inquiry. The dates for such will be published by way of public notice and other publicity in mid-May, I expect. But based on a pre-inquiry meeting mid-July and an inquiry starting the week commencing 9th of September 2019 for 3 weeks, we would expect a report to be received around 6 to 8 weeks from the end of the inquiry, that is by end November 2019. To move on to population and housing figures. The Isle of Man Strategic Plan 2016 outlines a commitment to plan, monitor and manage the provision of housing, in particular the amount of land needed to be allocated for housing in area plans. This includes the ability to modify the release of land for development through appropriate phasing in line with the methods set out in area plans. I think we would all agree that we need to have a responsive area plan system in which we can all place our trust. The Cabinet Office is committed to evidence-based planning, and the papers published last year alongside the written statement and maps of the East Plan will be revisited and updated where appropriate. These will sit alongside new evidence papers and supporting information produced in response to the consultation. Importantly, this will enable the Department to set out a clear and up-to-date position on a number of matters, including population and their effect on the island development plan and ongoing production thereof. Move to the methods to release land for development. Previous local and area plans have included development briefs. The intention is to publish such briefs for the East Plan in time for and to allow discussion at the inquiry. Development briefs are a useful tool to address phasing of land release, specific on-site matters such as layout, access and design. They seek to respond to known but surmountable constraints, prescribed advice from key stakeholders, the need for proper master planning, integration of affordable homes and other essentials to satisfy best practice in development and planning for our urban and rural environments. Development briefs will be part of the plan format going into inquiry, and I believe they have proved successful in smoothing routes through the planning application stages to actual delivery on the ground thereafter. And finally, in terms of the area plan for the North and West, a programme for government commitment, I can confirm that the intention is to look at the area of the North and West together. There is reason to be positive about the progress of the Eastern Area Plan over the next 6 months. As this gathers pace, it's my intention to launch early work on the area plan for the North and West. An extended call for sites, and I envisage this to last around 6 months, is scheduled to begin on the 31st of May 2019. Thank you, Honourable Members, for the opportunity to make
Honourable Members, questions are permitted on the statement. Mr Cretney.
Yes, could the Minister tell us who the appointed person is?
Minister.
The candidate has been identified. I think the Lieutenant Governor will be in a position to make advice as soon as he can.
Honourable Member for Middle, Mr Shimmons.
Thank you, Mr President. I welcome the statement and the commitment therein to evidence-based planning and to look at the population situation. It's now clear that we are some way adrift from the population projections which feed into the strategic plan and the Eastern Area Plan. When will the Minister reset the dial to reflect reality?
Reply, sir.
It's an important part of planning that we plan, monitor and manage, as I made very clear in the statement and in the run-up to the area plan for the process following the statutory situation. We'll be providing updated evidence papers and new evidence papers as I outlined in my statement, and one of those will deal with the population issue.
Honourable Member for Onken, Mr Callister.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was wondering if I can ask the Minister just to give me an overview, because I've not been involved in any public inquiry before, in respect of how the planning inspector actually calls witnesses. Is there any witnesses that are automatically guaranteed to sit in front of the inspector, or is it purely down to him personally or them personally to actually pick who they may or may not take evidence from?
Minister to reply.
No, thank you, Mr. President. That's a very good, helpful question. It is ultimately for the independent inspector how the inquiry is run. It's not always the case that we have a pre-inquiry meeting, but I would like to think that we will have one, and I believe it's quite likely that we will have one, and one has been discussed with the candidate. This will be an open invitation to hear a short hearing led by the inspector on matters of process and scope, and I believe at that time it will become clear who wants to have inquiry time to give verbal, oral evidence alongside written submissions that they've made, perhaps adding to them by the request of the inspector before it comes. And at that point, the duration of the inquiry and the nature of the inquiry and the scheduling of this sort of thing will be determined by the independent inspector.
Honourable Member Mr Shimmons.
Thank you, Mr. President. We know that household sizes are getting smaller, and there's a number of reasons for that. Yet the Cabinet Office projections have increased the average size of each housing unit. Why is this? And who made this decision?
Minister.
Thank you very much. There will be updated evidence paper and reflective of household size, and I really appreciate all of the submission by all of the armchair statisticians, professional statisticians around the island who've been very helpfully submitting evidence in respect of household size. There are all sorts of dimensions to this, to do with the demography and how it's developed, to do with the future of housing, and as I said, we will be submitting a revised and perhaps even a new evidence paper to the, as will the Department of Infrastructure, to the area plan for the East inquiry.
Honourable Member for Council, Mrs Paul Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just really to build on that, can I ask the Minister, in bringing forward new evidence papers, is it the intention to not only look at the demographics, but to look at what types of housing, not only in terms of size, but the different types of housing will be needed to address our population now and in the future, and where those types of housing might be best situated in order that we can best provide services for the different needs of our population?
Thank you, Mr. President. No, it's a good question, but that's what planning is all about. Ultimately, the independent inspector decides what form the inquiry has, what evidence is called from the Department of Infrastructure, the Cabinet Office, other people. These questions might well be the ones that the independent inspector seeks further clarification on, further information on, but I can certainly assure you that Cabinet Office is expecting that the independent inspector will be commenting on the allocation of land in different places, one line of questioning, and also the types of housing and the nature of housing inside those different types. That's exactly what planning is all about. It's such an important process. Humblest apologies that it takes so long, but it's absolutely vital that we get the area plan for the East right, because that's where so many people live and even more people come to work every day.
Mrs Keane.
Thank you, Mr. President. Could I ask the Minister to clarify the purpose and implementation of development briefs? These two are a useful tool to address the phasing of land release. Who determines which pieces of land are phased land release for development matters? And if they are to be released or published in time for the inquiry, how would the public have chance to express their opinion on where these phased land release would be? And would the phasing of the land release for that also be influenced by the need for development? So would lands be held back and not permitted for development and detailed plans unless the population size increased?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I want to thank the House of Keys downstairs for its careful attention to planning law as the bill goes through. The Legislative Council has got that pleasure in coming months. Knowledge of planning law is extensive and substantial in this honourable court, and honourable members will remember that ultimately it's Tynwald Court that will approve the area plan for the East on a proposal to it from Cabinet Office. So ultimately it will be all of us who approve the area plan for the East, subject then only to legal challenge 6 weeks weeks thereafter, potential legal challenge for 6 weeks thereafter. This is a public inquiry that's coming up. We had several stages along the way where the public could submit evidence. I think we've had 600 or 700 different pieces of evidence submitted to us along the way. That's why it's taking the time. We need to apply the right resource, the right attention, the right expertise to that analysis, and there's still plenty of opportunity for formal and submissions, and those people at the public inquiry will also be able to give oral evidence and answer questions if asked by the independent inspector. It's a very good process planning. It's going to work. In 2 or 3 years, we'll have the whole of the island zoned properly, and then a strategic policy will be sufficiently flexible through things like national policy directives to be able to respond to changing economic and demographic and other considerations, and then we'll all be richer because of it.
Honourable Member Mr Callister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr President. Can I ask the Minister when the pre-meeting will be held? Can I also ask the Minister who actually decided to hold this inquiry in September? As MHKs, we're encouraged to take holidays during August and September, and personally, I will say personally, after spending several weeks to submit a very detailed submission on behalf of my own constituents for this inquiry, I suddenly find that the inquiry is being held right bang in the middle of my holiday. And I have to say, okay, the Minister, you know, it might be done, but let's be fair here, Mr President. This public inquiry was meant to be held in March. It was then delayed to June and July. And now I'm being told that it's now going to be held in September. And I certainly want to stand in front of this planning inspector in order to submit verbally the evidence I've already submitted in writing. And I think somebody should actually explain to members, when we are encouraged to take holidays only in August and September, why the Minister's decided to put this right bang at the beginning of September.
The matter for members when they take their holidays. The formal sittings may be in recess, but very few members are necessarily on holiday.
Absolutely.
Minister to reply.
Thank you. I gave the indicative dates in the original answer. Members have that statement in front of them. Ultimately, it's for the independent inspector to choose how the inquiry takes place and the timing of the inquiry. But I was asked a very specific question, so I'll give a very specific answer. This Honourable Court set this date in the programme for government. In that, we have an action to complete the area plan for the East by December 2019. We've been up against it through various for various reasons, and the Chief Minister announced in his initial programme for government statement that planning reform was essential, and planning reform puts an area plan process to completion, and we are going to deliver according to that part of the programme for government. Apologies to the Honourable Member for Onken in terms of the holidays, but as I announced, our current plan is to ask the independent inspector to think about starting on the 9th of September. That date is still subject to negotiation and planning, and that's the sort of thing that will be discussed at the pre-inquiry meeting, which will be held according to the timetable I've already given in my statement.
Honourable Member for Middle, Mr Shimmons.
Thank you, Mr President. I'd like to revert to the matter of the average size that has been used in the assumptions. And it was great to hear the Minister say this is such an important issue. He said it was absolutely vital that we get this right. That gives me some assurance. If that's the case, is it the independent planning inspector that review this average size of housing unit? Should that not be a matter for this honourable court to discuss and debate in a transparent way? I still haven't heard who decided to increase the size of the average housing unit when we know that the average household is markedly in decline.
Thank you. The evidence paper that was submitted as part of the area plan for the East already has got an identified author inside that report, Cabinet Office, staff inside Cabinet Office, and I've already said that we'll be reviewing these things, and I appreciate the submissions from lots of people around, from some people around the island. The Honourable Member makes a very good point. When you do something like household size, you have to look backwards, and therefore we're extrapolating trends. But extrapolating trends is difficult. It depends on other things that are going on, like changes to demography. And the other point is policy determines the future. It's not only the trend in the past. And so therefore, if by chance this Honourable Court has a policy that's credible to the independent inspector and the Cabinet Office when we're making proposals to the independent inspector, has strong views. I guess that's the sort of thing that the independent inspector might take into account as they make recommendations back to Cabinet Office about what area plan for the East to bring to this Honourable Court for approval. So it's absolutely crucial, the nature of housing, absolutely crucial, the nature of demography, and these are two key issues about which further evidence papers will be submitted into the area plan for the East process.
Honourable Member Mr Crookall.
Thank you, Mr President. Just want to ask the Minister what his reasoning is for joining RAMS for the west and the north area plans together. It's as though they've set a date and they have to be completed by that date, so we'll just join these two together. I'm a bit concerned there that one area might dominate the other one, probably the west over the north.
Minister.
Well, by the time the area plan for the East is completed, 70% of the island's population will be inside an area planned process, and half of the island will be inside it. The north and the west are absolutely vital parts of our island, and I've picked up from members of this Honourable Court that they want us to get to helping development in the north and west as soon as possible. So this is a practical response. The law is not prescriptive about how many island plans we have. We want to complete this process now so that in the period 2021, 22 to 2026 we can revisit these plans to have an all-island plan at the next stage, a modern one by 2026.
Honourable Member for Ramsey, Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr President. I'd like to welcome the fact that we are finally getting a northern plan and a western plan. It does slightly concern me that just under half the island is going to be dealt with by a single strategic plan, and I'd like the Minister to take that on board. My question for the Minister starts off with, he said the inspector will decide what evidence is required as part of the inquiry. Is it not the case that any member of the public is entitled to be heard under the Town and Country Planning Act, whether or not the inspector wishes to seek particular types of evidence or not, and everyone has the legal right to be heard by that inquiry? I'd be grateful if the Minister could confirm that. I'd also be grateful if the Minister could advise what regard or what weight will be given to the inspector's report by the Cabinet Office. Again, the Town and Country Planning Act is quite specific that it's the Cabinet Office that will make a recommendation to Tynwald in respect of the plan. So how much regard and how much weight will the Cabinet Office be giving to the inquiry report, and what is the likelihood that actually the Cabinet Office will be overriding some of the information and output for that report for what may be considered policy means or policy decisions? I'm just trying to get a feel here for how independent this draft plan process is going to be when it finally reaches this Honourable Court.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. That's a good summary of the law according to my understanding. Evidence has been invited and evidence in good faith has been submitted. Cabinet Office is following the law and submissions in terms of making recommendations and also choosing what evidence to prepare and submit. And the independent process includes, the independence in the process includes an independent inspector and a public inquiry. At the next stage, that inspector will make a report to Cabinet Office, and at that point, Cabinet Office will, inside law, make a recommendation to this Honourable Court. And that's what happened with the area plan for the South, because that's compliant with law, and that's what will happen for the area plan for the East, because it's still compliant with law.
Honourable Member Mrs Masker.
Thank you, Mr President. Would the Minister agree that as we go forward, it will be vital to more accurately predict the population numbers if we are not to then over-identify sites that would potentially flood the market? We need to get accurate figures for housing need and housing provision rather than over-provide, which may actually have a negative effect in reducing the value of properties that already exist. And could I also ask the Minister, in preparing development briefs, is there any plan to provide development briefs for brownfield sites, maybe as a priority over greenfield sites again, so that we can give a better weighting to previously developed sites and again avoid developing greenfield sites in the countryside? Thank you, Mr President.
Mr Thomas.
I think there are four questions inside that, Mr President. One is about the accuracy of the figures, and I can assure you that Cabinet Office in all its parts tries very hard to make sure that we have accurate economic figures about demography and population. and also accurate figures about residential land availability, take-up of planning permissions. So we're doing everything we can to make sure we've got accurate figures. That leads on to the policy principles about how we plan, monitor, and then, most importantly, manage the release of land. And that's an issue for the area plan for the East, and I don't want to commit at this stage because that would be wrong under law, and also that's the whole issue that's at stake here. I'd also want to remind this Honourable Court that we have a clear programme for government policy in terms of the demography and in terms of the population. The locate.im policy, with all the codependencies around it identified very clearly in that report, makes it very clear that the programme for government is aimed at increasing the economically active population, making people have higher median earnings on average, that sort of average. We want to help people, and that's all going to make this place buzzing, such that we will need land for jobs and for residential life and everything that goes around it in a cultured place like this island is. So these are at the heart of the issues, and accurate statistics about the past are relevant, but also our policy collectively about what's going to happen in the future and what we want to happen in the future is also vital. And that leads on to the final question, which was about development briefs and whether we'll spend more time working on brownfield sites rather than greenfield sites. And I can absolutely assure the questioner in this Honourable Court that, for instance, the officers have worked really, really closely with Douglas Council, having site visits around the brownfield sites in Douglas to work up what everybody's intentions are for the brownfield sites in Douglas. I hope they manage to have the same in places like Onchan, where there are also brownfield sites, but I can only report on my knowledge of what's happened in Douglas. So the Tynwald Court policy on brownfield sites is important for this government and this court, and it's the sort of thing that informs the policy around the area plan for the East.
Mr. Shimmons.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was pleased to hear that the Cabinet Office are going to submit updated evidence taking account of the real world which we're operating in. Ahead of that, doing that update, will the Minister review the potential units available on brownfield sites? Because many people feel that the Cabinet Office statistics significantly understate brownfield site capacity. Will he undertake to carry out this review of brownfield site potential ahead of submitting evidence?
Reply, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think this Honourable Court will agree and understand, and therefore agree, that that's at the very heart of this public inquiry that's coming up in this area plan for the East process. There are different views on the intensity of development in brownfield sites. There are different views on how our urban centres develop. And that's exactly the sort of thing that needs to be decided in the area plan for the East process.
Mr. Shimmons.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've got two final questions. In terms of, will the evidence being submitted by the Cabinet Office, will it be publicly promulgated ahead of the Eastern Area Plan so other people can look at it and understand whether it's credible or not? And will it contain an updated tally of the need based on the actual residential units that have been built since the strategic plan numbers in the west, the south and the north, together with all the planning approvals which are currently active? And one last point about demographics. We know the demographic position. We know that the ageing population is a real factor for us. And the initial evidence submitted by the Cabinet Office did not factor this in at all. It was a simple spreadsheet. But the reality is that the ageing demographics may mean that we need fewer detached houses and more closely joined together residential communities. And again, this would reduce the overall land requirement, which is the figure that our planning inspector will work back to. So will all these factors be taken into account? It's important they are, and will they be published ahead of the public inquiry so that people can look and understand the Cabinet Office position?
Minister.
Yes. No. Well, clearly, evidence has always been published, so yes, it will be published. I think I outlined in the other place, if not here, when I was asked a question about land availability, that RLA 10 would be updated is being updated to version 11, and it will be updated to version 12 before the inquiry. And the figures we've already published for the West and the North can also be updated if that's helpful. And finally, in point 3, there's a clear point of view expressed in the question by the Honourable Member for Middle about residential communities and how older people are going to live and what the number of older people will be. This is exactly the sort of question that will be addressed in the inquiry and in the whole process, and it is the sort of thing that will be determined by Tynwald Court when the area plan for the East comes to this Honourable Court for approval.
Take a final question from Mr. Baker.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Would the Minister agree with me that the joint approach for the area plan for the North and the West is eminently sensible, given the historical aspect of the plans that are currently in place, but that the area plan, whilst it's a fundamental and very important part of our strategic plan, it is only one part of our planning system, and it needs to be done, but ultimately the market will respond to the actual events that happen over the next number of years in terms of the size of units that are developed, the locations that are developed, exactly as they have done for a number of years, and that inevitably, whatever the area plan says for the East or the North or the West, actions will come forward, proposals will come forward which will deviate from the area plan, as evidence in the Southern Area Plan shows, and that it's a plan that has value, but it isn't something which is cast in absolute tablets of stone, and that ultimately the crucial thing is that we have a flexible and adaptable planning system to make sure we do deliver the island that we want.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. I absolutely agree with the Chair of the Planning Committee, who's got such an in-depth, detailed knowledge of planning after intensive studies and experience. So, the first point is that, of course, the plan has value, but absolutely I acknowledge that market forces and lifestyle choices have absolute value as well. So, for instance, for years there's been development land that's available in the north, but which hasn't been taken up. That's an example of market forces in the process. But as I understand it, from intensive contact with surveyors and the like, as part of the rates modernisation process, things can change and are changing to an extent. So the island is becoming more of a one property market rather than a disparate, divided property market to an extent, and all that sort of stuff has been very helpful to learn a bit more about, talking to real surveyors with real knowledge of market forces. So that's, I think, the main point to say. The size of units, both in terms of the nature of units, in terms of employment, and also in terms of residential, what we need around our employment land and our residential land in terms of other facilities, health, care, education, all these other things are all changing all the time, and it's up to good planners to capture that for us. And to help planners capture that for us, we need to have the whole of government and so many people around government working together to inform the area plan for the East process and then the evolution of the strategic plan into the North and West, and itself being reviewed thereafter.